In the late 19th century, Egypt stood at the crossroads of empire. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, had transformed the country into one of the most strategically important locations on Earth. For Britain, whose global empire stretched from India to Africa, the canal was more than just a waterway. It was a lifeline. Nearly half of Britain's seaborne trade passed through the canal, linking the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean and dramatically shortening the route to India. This strategic importance meant that Egypt's political stability was now a matter of imperial concern. By the 1870s, however, Egypt was in turmoil. The country was ruled by Khedive Tawfiq Pasha, who had inherited a state riddled with debt. His predecessor, Ismail Pasha, had embarked on an ambitious program of modernization, building railways, expanding cities, and funding large-scale infrastructure projects. These projects were expensive, and Egypt had borrowed heavily from European creditors to finance them. When the debts became unmanageable, European powers stepped in. Britain and France established the dual control, a system that allowed them to supervise Egypt's finances directly. Many Egyptians saw this as a humiliating infringement on their sovereignty. Discontent boiled over in 1879 when Colonel Ahmed Urabi, also spelled Arabi, an officer in the Egyptian army, emerged as the face of a nationalist movement. Urabi represented the growing frustration of the army, which was dominated by Egyptian officers, but still heavily influenced by European advisors and dominated by Turkish and Circassian elites. Arabi's slogan, "Egypt for the Egyptians," captured the sentiment of many who wanted to end foreign interference and bring reforms to the country. The situation escalated quickly. Urabi and his supporters staged protests and gained significant backing from both the army and sections of the civilian population. They demanded constitutional reforms, the dismissal of unpopular ministers, and limits on foreign control. By 1882, the nationalist movement had grown powerful enough to challenge the authority of Khedive Tawfiq and his European allies. Britain, fearing for the security of the Suez Canal, decided to act. In June 1882, anti-European riots broke out in Alexandria, leaving hundreds dead, including over 50 Europeans. Britain saw this as the final straw. While France withdrew from military involvement, Britain sent a fleet to bombard Alexandria and deployed troops to protect its interests. Urabi responded by mobilizing his army and preparing for war, fortifying key defensive positions to resist a British invasion. The stage was now set for a decisive confrontation. The British Expeditionary Force under General Sir Garnet Wolseley would meet Urabi's troops in what would become the climactic battle of the Anglo-Egyptian War, the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. After the bombardment of Alexandria in July 1882, British forces quickly secured the city and used it as a staging ground for a full-scale campaign. General Sir Garnet Wolseley, a seasoned commander with prior experience in Canada, West Africa, and the Ashanti campaign, was chosen to lead the expeditionary force. His mission was clear: defeat Ahmed Urabi's army and restore Khedive Tawfiq's authority. Urabi, meanwhile, took a defensive approach. He withdrew his forces inland and fortified a line at Tel el-Kebir, a strategic location along the Sweetwater Canal in the Egyptian desert. Tel el-Kebir was about 110 kilometers northeast of Cairo and commanded the route to the capital. Urabi's position was formidable. A series of trenches, earthworks, and artillery batteries stretched for nearly 3 kilometers, manned by around 20,000 troops. He believed that the defensive line would blunt any British attack and allow him to hold out long enough to force a political settlement. But General Wolseley devised a daring plan. Rather than launch a frontal assault in daylight, which would have been costly given the strength of Urabi's fortifications, he opted for a night march followed by a surprise dawn attack. The British force consisted of about 17,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, and artillery, supported by Indian troops and Marines. The plan required precise timing and coordination. The men would march through the desert under cover of darkness, silently approach the Egyptian lines, and storm the defenses at first light. On the night of September 12, 1882, the march began. It was a tense and exhausting trek. The desert was pitch black, and the men had to remain completely quiet to avoid alerting the enemy. As dawn broke on September 13, 1882, the British troops were in position. At around 5:45 a.m., they launched their assault. The attack was swift and devastating. British infantry advanced in extended lines, firing disciplined volleys as they closed in on the Egyptian trenches. Despite fierce resistance, the element of surprise gave the British a decisive advantage. The Egyptians were caught off guard, and their defensive fire was scattered and uncoordinated. After about an hour of intense fighting, the Egyptian line collapsed. Cavalry units, including the Household Cavalry and Indian Bengal Lancers, pursued the retreating Egyptian troops across the desert, turning the battle into a rout. British casualties were relatively light, around 57 killed and 382 wounded, while Egyptian losses were much heavier, with over 2,000 dead and many more wounded or captured. The victory at Tel el-Kebir effectively ended the war. Urabi fled, but was soon captured, and the road to Cairo lay open for Wolseley's army. Within days, British troops occupied Cairo without further resistance, marking the complete defeat of the nationalist forces. The victory at Tel el-Kebir was a turning point not only for Egypt but for the wider Middle East. With Urabi's forces shattered and the Egyptian army in full retreat, General Wolseley wasted no time consolidating his gains. Within days, British troops advanced on Cairo, encountering minimal resistance. By September 15, 1882, they had occupied the Egyptian capital, effectively ending organized opposition to British intervention. Ahmed Urabi, the face of the nationalist uprising, surrendered shortly afterward. Rather than execute him, which might have risked turning him into a martyr for Egyptian nationalism, the British and Khedive Tawfiq opted for exile. Urabi was tried and initially sentenced to death, but his punishment was commuted to banishment to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, where he remained for many years before being allowed to return to Egypt later in life. His exile symbolized the suppression of Egyptian nationalist aspirations for the time being. The defeat of the nationalist movement had immediate political consequences. Khedive Tawfiq was restored to power, but now he ruled under the shadow of British influence. Though formerly Egypt remained part of the Ottoman Empire, British troops became the ultimate guarantors of political order. The so-called veiled protectorate was established, a system under which Egypt retained its nominal independence but was effectively under British control. The British stationed a garrison in Cairo and took charge of key government ministries, particularly finance and the military. Lord Cromer, or Sir Evelyn Baring, was appointed British Consul General and became the de facto ruler of Egypt. His administration focused on stabilizing the country's finances, reducing corruption, and improving irrigation systems to increase agricultural output. Cotton became the backbone of Egypt's economy, but this focus also made the country heavily dependent on global markets, leaving Egyptian peasants vulnerable to price fluctuations. Politically, the British allowed the Khedive to remain as a figurehead, but real power rested with the British Consul General. Egyptian political participation was severely limited, and nationalist sentiments were suppressed. But the memory of Urabi's revolt and the humiliation of defeat continued to inspire new generations of Egyptians. By the early 20th century, nationalist organizations and intellectuals were calling for constitutional government and independence. World War I further deepened Britain's grip on Egypt. In 1914, when the Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany, Britain declared Egypt a formal protectorate, deposing the Khedive and installing a more compliant ruler, Sultan Hussein Kamel. This legal change ended Egypt's nominal link to the Ottoman Empire, but reinforced its status as a client state of Britain. It was not until the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, a massive nationwide uprising led by Saad Zaghloul and the Wafd Party, that Britain was forced to reconsider its position. The revolution highlighted the strength of nationalist feeling and the unsustainability of direct control. In 1922, Britain unilaterally declared Egypt independent, though it retained control over defense, foreign policy, and the Suez Canal zone. Full sovereignty would not come until the 1952 revolution, when the Free Officers, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, finally ended the monarchy and expelled the last vestiges of British influence. The Battle of Tel el-Kebir thus marked the beginning of 70 years of British involvement in Egypt. It reshaped the balance of power in the Middle East, secured Britain's imperial lifeline, and left a deep imprint on Egyptian